Farming food and fashion for a discerning world is serious business in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are new opportunities everywhere just waiting for the open-minded. Sarah's Country shines a light on the matters that matter most. And here's your host, Sarah Perriam.
Kia ora and welcome to another week in Sarah's Country, a world of opportunity and optimism in the face of exponential change facing farming, food and fashion here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, a topic that I've been actually waiting for the right opportunity to explore and dive in on your behalf for some time now is the elephant in the room, is the challenge facing farming here in New Zealand is the rising age of our farmers and the future of the family farm. So how do we arm our families with practical action steps to achieve a healthy transition to the future for both the family relationship, but not setting up the next generation to fail? Well, in this week's Opinion Maker, we're going to dive into this for the next hour with our panel of experts on this topic: a legacy or a liability, how to get succession right. And why? Well, do you know our consumers actually love the idea of purchasing from family farms that with an intergenerational purpose to bring custodianship to our planet and their health and the strengths of our communities, as we've been seeing in the last month with these floods, is our communities' dependence on farming families and having that intergenerational legacy being the fabric of these communities. But times are changing, and we have to navigate a world of being fair and equal when that in itself is challenging. Gone are the days of handing down the family farm to the eldest. So also what is changing is banks' expectations on farming families and trust law changing. So this is your opportunity to sit back as we unpack with our panel today this big topic. Introducing the reason why I kicked off this was there is a 4-part workshop that Wanganui Development Agency has been backing the work of Family Business Central. So introducing to the panel, firstly, to get a bit of an understanding on the work that he does, Philip Pryor. He's no stranger to the world of family business, growing up running the real estate and travel agency in Blenheim. His parents had during childhood, and following a degree in psychology, from Otago University and a master's in the US, Philip went to build a career as a business advisor. He worked in the US, UK, Australia and New Zealand, working with government, corporate sector and non-for-profits, and he's been focused particularly in working with family businesses for the last 15 years, joining us from across the ditch. Philip, in all your years, how far have we come in the space of supporting family business transitions?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for having me on. The short answer is not very far, to be really honest. It's an issue that has been around. There's no fast, easy answers to it, although I think we've made some progression in some of the ways. The old days of we give it to the older son, or pass it on to the older son, thankfully is passing. But, there's still a bit of that around. I was involved with some research with MB a couple of years ago into succession. And, there is a real reluctance around for family businesses, whether it's a business or a farm, to really have the conversations that need to be had. And a lot of it is, there's several issues, right? But a lot of it is actually almost fear, in terms of not wanting to upset the apple cart. Sometimes it's for parents, it's facing their own mortality. And there's a thing we call founder syndrome, which is the fear of, well, what do I do if I don't run this farm? Why do I get up out of bed sort of thing? So there's a number of reasons in it, but it is such an important area to be, for us, in New Zealand to really be looking at and thinking about, because, as you said, people love family businesses and family farms. They love buying from them. We know the research clearly tells us this. And so how do we support them? They're the most resilient businesses around. And yet the statistics in terms of successful succession, I don't want to say that after too many drinks, is pretty tough. It's pretty woeful, really.
Philip, thank you. Philip, founder of Family Business Central, setting the scene for us there. Moving on to our next guest on our panel today. He knows it's the focus of farming businesses is a hard one, with succession planning challenges in his own family farm and the sheep and beef property near Waimate, but now working passionately to help family farms with their conversations with banks. Tom Lamming from NZAB joining us now. Tom, do you want to share just a little bit of scene setting around your personal journey heading into the role you are in now?
Yeah, hi Sarah, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Scene setting. So I guess, in terms of current role, working for NZAB, and our focus is around financial and strategic advisory services for mostly farming businesses. And of those farming businesses, most of them are family operations. And if I look back further than that, my background's in rural banking for 15 or 16 years. And again, the bulk of the businesses that I was involved with were family operations, and grew up on a family farm, which is no longer in the family. And we went through our own succession journey. But so I guess that's a little bit of my story. I guess picking up on Phil's points around succession and where it's progressed to. I think I disagree slightly. I think there has been progress there, and I think it's some of that is just the change in perception and the change in attitude around what succession looks like. But I think some of the changes also in terms of indirectly the things that influence and support succession. So things like communication, running farms like businesses, not like farms. Focused around profit as opposed to capital growth. I think some of the diverse skill sets that are coming into some of these family businesses from the next generation that's been out and about and done some different things. I think all of those aspects are really supportive of good succession outcomes. Still hard. There's no doubt there's an absolute challenge there to do it equitably and do it fairly, but I think we've made progress in terms of those key elements that will support a good succession outcome.
Yeah, and joining us also on the panel here in studio is partner for Wynne Williams here in Christchurch, Phoebe Davies. Phoebe specialises in corporate and commercial law and has a passion for agribusiness, as she's on the Canterbury committee of the New Zealand Institute for Primary Industry Management. And, of course, farming in her own right with partner David here in a four-way equity farming partnership. So you're right at the coalface around how getting structure right at the start is so important. What are you seeing from a legal perspective of family farming businesses starting to take that seriously?
Yeah, well, I think there's still the same issues that have been there for a long time about, how you provide for all the children, who's going to take it over, how you make sure the parents are stepping away at the right time and receiving the money they need to support them in their retirement. However, I feel like the legal issues surrounding the matter have got more and more complex over time, and they just continue to. It's not a case of just understanding trust law or commercial law. You've got so many factors that actually feed into it. So, there's been huge changes to the Trust Act earlier this year. So there's trust law. You need to make sure that your wills feed into that. There's relationship property matters. There's commercial matters because, as Tom just mentioned, like, farms are businesses and making sure they're run profitably as a business, and a lot of limited companies. So have you got a shareholders agreement in place? There's actually a lot of elements that feed into it. And unless you structure it correctly at the start, it can actually be quite hard to unwind and to actually get the right processes in place. So it's really key to step back and take that holistic view and actually make sure you look at all of the elements all together.
Before you step into the likes of Phoebe's office to sit down and start dotting I's and crossing T's, the fundamentals come back, Philip, to the emotional side of getting this right from the start and setting up the family businesses' attitudes towards why they would want to continue a business that surrounds family, as opposed to either one, selling it off or making it more corporatized. How do you begin to start to have those conversations when there is heightened emotion around the sentiment of this property?
Look, it's a really good question. And I think I'd link back to some of the stuff that Tom really said in terms of that ability to communicate and manage emotions, because we've worked with a number of different farms where they've done the finances, but actually it was nothing to do with the finances. It was the emotion and the feeling around, is it fair or not? And fairness is something that drives a lot of our feelings in a family business in one way or another. So and sometimes there are real constraints. The parents might have a farm that, I don't know, $4 or $5 million worth of farm that goes to one son, but they don't have another $4 or $5 million to go to the other 3 children, type of thing. So how do you balance that? And that takes a real level of both communication, as Tom was saying, and a look at how do we feel about this? And for a lot of families, that's often a very confronting conversation, to do that. So we talk about, we have a sort of, we wouldn't be a good consultant if we didn't have a 3-circle model. And so we talk about fairness, honesty, and transparency. And so if you can juggle those and have the honest conversations, that there is a proper level of transparency, and you're constantly negotiating, because fairness doesn't mean equality. It's a feeling. And if you can actually start having those conversations, it helps enormously. I mean, we talk about 2 types of governance. You've got business governance, and again, Phoebe was talking about the shareholders and the shareholders agreements and board and so on. But you need the family governance as well, and trying to bring that in that matches and talks to one another. We actually do see families transform, by going through that process. But it takes a bit of work.
And this leads my thoughts, Tom, to go to families that I know of that the patriarch of the family has done incredibly well in industry positional leadership, is held on pedestals, is financially created an empire, yet the governance of their own family is terrible. And it's so sad what happens as well throughout that lack of focus on family governance and getting that right. What are you seeing when you have to have those hard conversations with your clients around the fundamentals of structure, and how each individual element of that family want to have an outcome that is fair as opposed to equal of their own desires in life?
Yeah, good question. I think just picking up on Philip's point around the communication piece, the earlier this stuff starts, the better. I don't think there's a time where it can be too early, to be honest. The more that, as Philip said, you've got transparency and you've got honesty, I think the more likely you are to get a fair outcome, and that can start with, kids as teenagers, being quite open about the business, I think, for a start, and creating that understanding of what actually, that family farming business entails, so that there is some appreciation there for what's been built and what's possible, and what is there available potentially to be able to be transitioned to that next generation. So creating that understanding and feeding that from a high level of communication is really important. And then you bring in the other elements of what makes the fundamentals of what makes those processes happen, and that is openness, that is a willingness from all parties to engage and to actually make these things happen. To your point, Sarah, you do see that patriarchal kind of attitude of wanting to hold on and wanting to almost rule from the grave. Well, that just doesn't work. There's got to be a willingness there to find some sort of fair and equitable outcome. And I think, the other key element really is then, particularly if you've got that kind of, maybe that sort of attitude pervading through the business, but just more generally speaking, is the role of independence. These, as Philip said, these are highly emotive processes. So having people who can come in there and provide an objective view and an impartial view of what's happening, and help with that communication, help with the communication of individuals' needs and desires through the process, and help navigate some of those emotions as it goes. Those are some of the real key fundamentals of a successful outcome.
Phoebe, what would be your advice in preparation before sitting around the likes of your table at Wynne Williams to actually have productive conversations from the outset?
It's about working out where you want to end up. So the quite hard thing for us to tell clients is what they're hoping to achieve. We can help them discuss it and navigate through it. But essentially, we need to have an idea of what they're hoping to get out of it. You know, we can't tell the parents when they want to retire, or how much they're going to need to live off when they retire, or how essentially, you know, whether the son wants to run the farm or the daughter wants to run the farm. And it's amazing how sometimes clients do come to us without having really had many of these conversations.
There's a lot of assumptions.
Yeah. And, you know, we can very much help on the legal structuring, and we can talk through all these matters. But, you know, if they have a really good idea of where they want to get to, we can then help them on that journey to get there. But it's just having that kind of idea of where they want to be. And it is really difficult, you know, as Tom just mentioned, it's a very emotive topic. It can be quite distressing for the parents to think about, and it can be really hard because actually sometimes there's just no completely fair way to do it. And it does mean that one sibling might miss out slightly more than another, but it's about just achieving the best outcome for everybody.
Philip, who is the likely one that usually reaches out to the likes of your business? Is it usually someone who's wanting to prepare well in advance, or is it someone who feels that the process isn't going anywhere when they actually want to sit down? And it could be a child or the parent. I'd really love to know how it all usually starts in your experience.
Look, it's an interesting question. We've just done with a colleague of mine up in Queensland, did a road trip around a whole bunch of rural and regional areas up in Queensland. And it was overwhelmingly what we call the current generation. So these are the kids who are in their 30s, 40s, maybe 50s, and their parents are still around and still involved. And they're the ones that really want to have these conversations because they want a level of, I guess, a level of certainty to some degree, but they sort of are worried that, you know, things are going to fall through the gaps. So, you know, the wills may not be right, or or there's disagreements within the family that everyone is just politely ignoring. They know that, you know, and it happened to me in my own family. There was a lack of clarity, and there was an almighty eruption, you know, when my parents died. So, you know, it's often that concern, and how do you engage the conversation with, you know, what we call the senior generation, without, you know, effectively them feeling like they're being, you know, put out to pasture. Because they don't want to be put out to pasture. You know, they love this, and they shouldn't be either. But it's how do you? There's just a lot of, no one wants to offend anybody. Parents want to feel like they're being fair to their children. And their children certainly don't want their parents to feel like they're being kicked out, or, you know, that sort of thing. So it's that tentativeness, and really, as Tom said, having almost an independent person who can just help, you know, navigate the family through these conversations and raise the issues that often no one else wants to raise. You know, the pink elephant sitting in the corner that everybody's politely ignoring. But actually, we need to have a conversation around these.
Tom, from your angle, is that similar?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I don't think there's one particular part of these families that you could identify that leads to stuff necessarily. I mean, I think, to be fair, a lot of the time, the lead or the energy will come from mum, because I guess she sees the risks here of a poor process, and you know, tends to be the glue that holds these families together. So, you know, quite often the drive or the impetus will come from from the mother to try and protect those elements that she holds really dear. But yeah, look, I don't. Other than that, I don't think there's. You could identify one particular part. But yes, I think that next generation, you know, they tend to provide that drive, that impetus. You know, maybe they've been out and you know, they've got a different perspective, and they can bring that to the table. And sometimes they feel the frustration of not being able to do that really effectively. And again, that's where, you know, an independent, or most often, you know, a team of independent people or team of advisors, helping facilitate that process, but also who can navigate the different generations. You know, one advisor may be able to connect with a certain generation than the other, but together you can actually work together to get an outcome, and foster and facilitate that communication where it might not be happening otherwise.
Phoebe, the other thing too I do know is that if you sort of say, for instance, a child or a daughter-in-law wants to reach out for some form of independent legal advice to understand their position first, that may just start the relationship off on the wrong track when it comes to succession planning. Is there any advice in like how to navigate getting advice and nudging it along, but rather than you're out to screw me?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really, really tricky issue. Relationship property, I mean, the starting premises is that if you're either married or you're in a de facto relationship, you should assume that it's 50-50 on everything you own, which is just the starting point. It's, it doesn't always end up being the case, but it's, the basic premise. And that's unless you have a relationship property agreement, which is a bit like a prenup. It effectively contracts out of the act and you set out who owns what and how things will be divided if you separated. Now, this is really, really key with family farms. And the issue we often come across is it's often the parents that raise it to the children. So, they might say to their son or to their daughter that, have you, you did get to get a contracting out agreement. You need to get that sorted, which then when you, the son goes and tells his lovely wife or partner that his parents think that he should get a contracting out agreement, it doesn't always go down that well.
The morning of the wedding.
Exactly. Or, after 3 kids or something. So it is a really, really sensitive topic. We obviously advise that it is really good to have them. That said, if you don't have them, it's about being aware of the risks. So it's about being clued up to understand what your exposure is, how that would be worked through if you don't have it. And it just helps save a lot of arguments if you do have them. But it is a really delicate subject to navigate. I'd suggest by not going in and saying my parents have said we need one, because that usually starts with the premise that the in-laws don't like you, which isn't the case. They just want to make sure that they can protect their child's assets and that they haven't spent their lives working towards building up a family farm that then does get split up. Because, that's the issue, is that if you can't afford to buy the other person out, you end up selling the farm to pay them out. And that's what can be really devastating. So it's a very tricky issue to navigate, and it does need to be done sensitively. And that said, if you start to go down that path of getting a relationship property agreement, so to, effectively have your prenup, you legally have to get separate independent legal advice on that. So it does mean that everyone's interests are covered carefully.
Mm. Philip, just whilst we're on that topic of, dare I say it, the daughter-in-law, what is the right way of going about it? I mean, if you have missed the boat on having these conversations with your children as teenagers and you are a week out from a wedding, as such, I mean, what have you seen as some examples that it has worked really well?
Look, it's a huge minefield. The whole prenup thing, as Phoebe's saying, is just obviously incredibly difficult and challenging. I worked with one family where they decided that the kids were all to get retrospective prenups. And after 4 years, one of the daughters came back saying, going through this prenup is wrecking my marriage. So we're not going to do it. We have to find something else. And so there are some other potentially creative ways, but as Phoebe said, they've got to understand the risk. The challenge with in-laws, and a lot of in-laws, and again, our research is bringing this up. A lot of in-laws feel often the poor relative, but the reality is they're the parents of the next generation, and so they're often, they're often enormously. Well, they are enormously influential, but, enormously supportive, but often they're sort of often kept in the outer. People talk about bloodline and all that sort of thing. I actually think we need to get over ourselves to some degree on this, because it's they are there will be no second generation without them. All right. It's as simple as that. And so finding ways to manage it, of course, we know what are the statistics are roughly 50% of marriages fail. So you have to manage that risk as well. But there's not a simple one. I mean, we did one with a family where instead of doing a prenup, there was an agreement that the business was valued at when they got married, and that the agreement was if there was a divorce, the business would be valued at that point, and then they would get some of that money rather than ownership or shares or something like that. there are some other ways, but these are the really challenging conversations to have. I'd be interested actually in Phoebe's thoughts on around that one.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in actually on that, Phil, because in New Zealand, that wouldn't actually be binding. The only way you can provide that if you split up, how the assets will be separately either appraised or apportioned is through a Section 21 agreement, which has to be signed off by independent lawyers. So that you might be able to do it in Australia or various other jurisdictions, but it wouldn't actually be binding over in New Zealand. So sometimes people think they've agreed things here, and actually when it comes to it, that's not the case. And that can also be quite heartbreaking for the families.
Tom, from a bank's risks perspective, they ask for contents insurance and life insurance evidence to cover mortgages and those sorts of things. But are they also prepping for future risk management over these issues?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, any banker looking at a family operation is going to look at the risks around succession and want ultimately a strategy articulated to them as to how that is going to be managed, or the process to get to a point where it can be managed. So, again, communication becomes really important, not just internally, but with external stakeholders to the business. And that's not necessarily providing them all the answers, because often all the answers won't be there, and that will take a long time to evolve. But actually communicating the fact that you're on a journey, the strategy around it, that to Phoebe's point, you have a picture of where you want to go. You might not have the answers as to how you get there yet, but you have a picture of what you want that ultimately to look like is really important, and that becomes a bit of the guiding force of what you're doing as a family anyway. And communicating that and making sure that you or someone alongside you is helping engage the bank along that journey. And ultimately, I think, Sarah, the best thing that you can do from the bank's perspective to calm any fears that they might have around succession is to run a good business. A good business that's well structured, that has a clear strategy, that's profitable. It's going to have the fundamentals there to facilitate succession. That's the ultimate thing you can do to help the bank get comfortable with what that journey might look like.
And let's carry on governance, because we're at Easter, we stay with some friends who own a high country station, and they said the very best thing they ever did for their family was appoint a board and appoint a chair, that they both could have good, robust discussions on on-day farm-to-farm management, as well as long-term planning. Is it just part and parcel, Philip, now for farming businesses? They're multi-million-dollar businesses with multitudes of different risk factors, that we should have boards and chairs in all of our family farming businesses?
Absolutely. That's our strong recommendation, that you're dealing with businesses that are many millions of dollars and complex and so on. So a solid board is fantastic, whether that's a board of directors, whether you go for more an advisory board type of setup. It is just good practice, and we've seen a number of farming families just flourish with a good board that's helping them do that. Now, the thing that we see that a lot of farming families do is that they also start talking about family stuff, in fact, which is in what is actually a business meeting in the board, right? So which is why you have the business governance, which is the board and so on, but you have the family governance. So the family stuff is talked about in the family governance, primarily the family council via the family charter, where the business stuff is talked about at the board. And it's really, we talk about which hat are you wearing? Are you wearing your board member's hat, or are you wearing your mum and dad hat or your sibling hat? And you don't want to mix those conversations up. And we're working with a family in the Manawatu recently, and they've got a great board and it's working well, except they bring all the family stuff in there. It's like, no. That's what the family council is for, where you talk about it and you have that degree of separation. It's almost the same people, but actually it's a different conversation. And that's a really important distinction for families that run businesses need to get their head around.
Phoebe, have you got more to elaborate on the right way of governance structures for family businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, just to say what Phil was saying there about the need for the kind of family board also alongside the actual business board, I think is really important, because unless you have that distinction and allow people to air those points, because, you know, the family is such a big part of the business, then things do get muddied. So I think that's actually a really good point there. And then I think the thing that I always find interesting is that nowadays it's so easy to either set up a trust or to set up a company, however you're running your business, that a lot of people do this and then they don't really know what their obligations are in relation to that. So a lot of people that have got a limited company would have no idea of A, what their liability is as a director, and B, what their obligations and duties are. And the same as a trustee, which, you know, the obligations on trustees now are far more copious than they ever used to be. And a lot of people have no idea about this and what they need to be doing. So I think it is really important to take the governance role seriously, because as long as you're actually acting within the realm of what you should be doing and adhering to your duties, you're relatively well protected. But if you're not, that's when you're actually exposing yourself to personal liability. So I think for any family businesses, it's really important to have a good grasp on governance. You know, enroll in some governance courses. There are plenty of opportunities out there through institutes such as the New Zealand Institute of Primary Industry Management. They do a lot of governance workshops. There's also the Institute of Directors that do them. There are a lot of resources out there where people can learn what their roles are and how to be managing things correctly, or even just ask your lawyer or accountant. And a lot of them can give you advice. But yeah, making sure you've got a correctly formed board, having a chairperson, keeping notes from your meeting, just general business hygiene is really important and can be really helpful down the line.
Tom, are you seeing the bank's role being able to start to suggest that this is now a requirement of lending and support ongoing, so that there is a way forth? I mean, I'm liking this to what we're seeing for the banks leading with sustainable finance, natural capital. Can we have these conversations to encourage this direction?
Yeah, I mean, we see it at a more at a corporate level or larger scale businesses where the banks are actually asking for formal governance. For the typical family farming business, not so much. But what we do see very clearly from the banks is a desire for a couple of things. One is certainly some independence in there, and second is for a really clear strategy. And both of those things feed into good governance. And whether that's the formality of a board, I mean, I think that's probably a step too far for a lot of typical family farming businesses. But advisory board, some sort of structure there to bring some independence, to bring some accountability, to help set strategy, to help execute strategy, most importantly. And a mindset from the owners of that business where they buy into that involvement of externals in the business in some way, shape, or form, and absolutely would support what Philip and Phoebe are saying around governance skills. Go and develop those skills. Go and find people who can bring those skill sets to the table, and it doesn't have to be in an overly formal setting, but the skills and the fundamentals of good governance applied in any setting really are going to help you immeasurably in a succession process.
In summary, I'm going to ask each of you sort of maybe top 3 things that would be key advice to those returning to the family farm or maybe potentially starting outgoing farming to make sure that you get right first to set yourself up and your family for success. I'll start with you, Philip.
Okay, I think the key thing is actually start having these conversations. We are usually more worried about them than they actually are in real life. They're not as bad as we think they're going to be. People, families love each other enormously, and often we're worried about bringing these issues up, but actually they're usually easier than we thought. And we see this time and time again where people go, "Oh my goodness, we have to talk about this," and it's okay. I think also the other thing is just be this governance, whether it's family governance or the family charter, the family council, or as Phoebe said, the family board, and things like the business governance. It just brings a level of rigor into it, and it allows you to have the family to have the conversations on it. And finally, you've got to think long term. We think 40 years. Any family we work with, we're saying we want a 40-year time frame on this. So things that you're starting to look at now have got to have some relevance potentially for your great-granddaughters, right? And so if you really want to build a legacy, you need to be looking that far ahead.
Tom?
Yeah, reinforcing what Philip said, communication for a start. And as I said, you just can't start that too early. And that's communication of needs. It's communication of, as I said earlier, what actually is our business? What do we own? What do we do? What makes us successful? What are the risks in our business? What are the opportunities that we have? Making sure that everyone understands those elements and where do we want to go? Communicate that as individuals and as a family and start to really build that picture that you can be unified as a family around, but also that you can communicate to the people that you have around you. So communication, run a good business. You just cannot do succession without having a good business. So that's balance sheet, that's absolutely profitability. It's the things that go around it in terms of your operating model, it's your governance, all those elements that go into running a good business will feed a successful succession outcome. And lastly, independence. Find good independent people who you can put around your business, people that can either bridge generations or that can, that can mesh with one generation or another, and people who will challenge you. People who are really going to come in and bring a level of accountability, who are not afraid to ask hard questions, who are genuinely going to, provide that level of independence and accountability that's going to help you through this process.
And with you, Phoebe.
Yeah, well, firstly, similar to both Tom and Phil, is having that conversation and making sure you're all on a common page. So understanding where you want to get to. It's the worst thing when someone spent 20 years slaving away on the family farm to realise that what they expected was going to happen isn't what everyone else expected. So, firstly, having that conversation and getting common agreement. Secondly, get it documented. Because again, if you don't do that, you don't want to spend 20 years working on the farm to realise that actually, your dad drops dead and the will doesn't provide for what you thought it was going to provide for, and actually you're just left in the lurch. So making sure you all go to your lawyers, you get everything documented, you make sure the wills reflect what they should do. If there's a trust involved, that's correctly drafted. And, if it's run through a company, you've got a shareholders agreement. And that is really, really important with limited companies. A lot of people, because they're family businesses and closely held, they don't think they need a shareholders agreement, and they really do. So, making sure secondly, it's all correctly drafted and everything's locked in. And thirdly, think about the future. Make sure that you're actually looking ahead and you're thinking about what you want to do for your next generation and where you want to take the farm and what your ambitions are with it. Because if you're too stuck in the present, you're not looking forward and you won't make those things happen.
I want to thank all three of you for your time. I am humbled in my selection of people that to come around this topic from such diversity, but all around the common value that you all share, wanting to make sure that you're set up for success in your farming family business. Philip Pryor from Family Business Central joining us there ahead of a 4-part workshop that Whanganui Regional Council are pulling together. Tom Lamming from NZAB, a client director based out of Timaru, and Phoebe Davies, a partner at Wynne Williams in Christchurch. Thank you all so much for your time. Now, if you're interested in getting in touch with any of our guests or for some more resources on this topic, head to the description wherever you are watching or listening to this episode to be able to propel you forward on your farm family succession planning journey. It'd be interesting to know the makeup of the people that have tuned into this particular episode. But in the meantime, the main thing is that you took some value forward for your journey. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch through this Serious Country Opinion Maker this week. Now, before I let you know about what is coming up for the rest of the week on Serious Country, head to seriouscountry.com and click subscribe to sign up to our email newsletter. It's called the Serious Country Club. Basically gives you a bit of a heads up on what is coming up in the week ahead and some of the themes and topics of Serious Country that you may have missed from throughout. So there is a lot of podcast audio only episodes. We do a video show now only once a week at 7 o'clock on Tuesdays, and everything else is there for you on demand on podcast. Tomorrow we are going to be catching up with Dr. Mark Ferguson, our change maker, who is honing down on facial recognition technology within sheep. Yes, not all sheep are the same. They are individually different in being identified with facial recognition technology, not only in the yards, but out in the field, and what that will do for our genetic gain in our sheep industry. To close out the week, our Changemaker on Friday, we're heading across the ditch to learn about a concept called Grow Ag. The Australian government are throwing the resources at bringing research projects to light for investment, so to speed up their ag tech. Where does that leave New Zealand, and what are the opportunities for us to follow in their footsteps? And then on Thursday, our Sarah Sisters this week, we're heading to Northwood, of all places, to catch up with Charlotte Heald, where she has some, we had a really great practical chat actually about rural woman wellbeing and how to predominantly put yourself first in those challenging environments of being not only a mother, but also a businesswoman on the farm as well. All that on Sarah's Country's podcast, on everywhere that you listen to podcasts. In the meantime, wherever you are around the world, take care of yourself and your loved ones. Haere rā.